So welcome everybody. Thanks for being here for today's webinar from Pinnacle Health Informatics. This is Ginger Bandine. I'm the Director of Clinical Data and Analytics at Pinnacle, and I'm pleased to introduce Shawn Frasier. Shawn is excited today to be demonstrating and explaining some things about R scripting, which is this super fancy thing, and he was showing me some of the stuff he's been doing, and I'm really excited about it. So we'll get started here, and I'll let you take it away, Shawn.
Thank you, Ginger. Thanks, everybody, for attending today. This is something we wanted to talk about for a long time, and this is a good entree to the subject. Wanted to give an introduction to this. It's still something that all of us are probably learning about. It's great to think of some new projects we could do using R, and that's the best way to learn it and become familiar with it. So we wanted to talk a little bit about it today and show a little bit what can be done. I wanted to focus on Power BI and SQL reporting services. We'll look at SQL Server, look at a little bit of TSQL today. The first question is, what is R? So some people may be very familiar with it, others may be not so familiar. So R is a scripting language which has been around since the 90s. I think it was invented in New Zealand, and from New Zealand it spread throughout the world and has become extremely popular, and it's a language and environment for statistical computing and graphics. One real big advantage of R is that it's free. It's a free tool. It competes with other statistics packages. Some of them you maybe have heard of, Stata, or MATLAB, or RapidMiner. There's a bunch out there. A lot of the universities use some of those, and they can be quite expensive. They're very, very powerful, but R is free, and so it's become very popular, and it's very capable. It's widely supported. There's a big user community. I'll give you a few links out to it today. The thing that makes R powerful and useful is it has thousands of statistical and graphics packages, and they are called packages. So if you're ever around a real R aficionado and you call them libraries, because other programming languages refer to these self-contained units of code as libraries, they will upbraid you because you refer to them as a library. They are packages in the R world, and these packages allow you to do all kinds of statistical operations. So regression, distribution, clustering, classification, machine learning, etc. So we'll show you a few of the packages that we have loaded up here today. They're very, very powerful and very useful, and there's, like I said, literally thousands of these that you can utilize to look at your data. So what tools can you use if you're interested in learning more about R? Are there free tools out there? Absolutely. Probably the most common one is called RStudio, and you can download that from www.rstudio.com, and it has links to all kinds of resources and cheat sheets and all kinds of sample data sets and things like that. You can also go to www.r-project.org, and that's kind of the main repository of everything R worldwide. And you can download all kinds of interesting things, all your packages and things like that there, and lots of tutorials and interesting things as well. There's also an R tools for Visual Studio. So if you like to work in Visual Studio, I like to work in Visual Studio a lot because that's what we build our other data products in. They do have an R tools, and I'm going to show a little bit of these here in just a moment. And then SQL Server 2016 and thereafter, so the newer 2016 and all the newer versions have R services embedded in them, and that makes it really nice to work in a SQL environment, and we'll show a little bit of that. And in fact, it's kind of evolved now that it's, and I should have put it here, but it's now called Microsoft Machine Learning Server. They have a new component that's called their MLS, or their Machine Learning Server. So let me show you quickly just a little bit about some of these tools, and some of you may have these. You may have these already installed. So this is RStudio. It's a pretty simple looking program. It's got a few little windows here that help you navigate around in your environment. So the top left one here, it shows you all of the packages that you have currently installed. And so you can see here, there's quite a few here that we have installed. They have names like stats, the RStats package, OLAP R, OLAP Cube Access in R. That's very powerful. Microsoft R umbrella package. Matrix, space and dense matrix classes and methods. Anyway, a whole bunch, and you can install many, many more. It's very easy to do. You can just very quickly install a package, and it'll be available for your use. Down here is the R interactive window on this bottom left-hand corner, and it's nice because it's where you actually execute your R code and build your R scripts. And it looks a little funny. That's the one thing about R that's the challenging for me, at least, is learning the syntax, and it's got a certain kind of a syntax, and it is kind of code heavy. But I've found that I'm using the same things over and over, and there's a lot of boilerplate content out there that you can drag and drop. Up here in the top right-hand corner, you're looking at your variables, and this is going to be your environment and things that are going on. Then you have your plotting window down here where you can actually visualize your data. There's a lot of built-in visualizations. And just to show you an example, I'm going to run a sample here to show you what's capable in here, and it's called demo. It's just called demo, and it'll demonstrate the graphics. There's all kinds of demos that people have built and you can download. You can see here that, here's a demo of what they call simple use of color in a plot, right? Here's an example of a color wheel, and you can see above it all of the different variables are changing and modifying as these change. You can change the look of the chart and things like that. They have all kinds of charts, box plots. On a previous webinar, we've looked at box plots and data variants. And that's kind of those are very powerful. Other kinds of charts, histograms, distribution charts. These are nice. These trellis charts with these multiples of what they call multiples of small variables. This is a sample data set that comes with RStudio. It's called Edgar Anderson's Iris data about his flower collection. A guy assembled a whole bunch of data, but you can use that to learn R and then use that in other data projects. You can start looking at distributions and correlation, things of that nature. Does topographic mapping. Another kind of distribution chart looking at different variables. So kind of interesting. If you're interested in R, this is probably the place to start. It's a great tool, and it's just RStudio. Lots of samples, lots of healthcare stuff. You can download huge data sets from the National Health Service, or NIH, National Institute of Health, that you can then, and they have whole R projects as well that you can use to start looking at data and then apply them into your own healthcare environment. So that is RStudio. The other tool that we use is R tools for Visual Studio. And I'll show you that here. And it looks kind of the same. But if you like Visual Studio, it has kind of a Visual Studio feel, and you can have your other projects running at the same time. This I gave the link to in the presentation, and I'll go back to that, where you can download what are called R tools for Visual Studio. If you're using the newer version, this is 2015. If you're using 2017, then the install is a little bit different. It's in what they call the data science workload. But anyway, these have a lot of samples, and it's kind of organized the same. This has a little bit nicer package manager. I can see all of my packages that I have installed. So today we're going to be looking at, we're going to be using some packages called dplyr. See, and I've got that installed, and it gives you a little explanation. It says a fast, consistent tool for working with data frame-like objects, both in memory and out of memory. We're also going to be using ggplot2. And you get a little explanation. A system for declaratively creating graphics. You provide the data, tell ggplot2 how to map variables to aesthetics, what graphical primitives to use, and it takes care of the details. And it's actually kind of amazing. You can do some pretty good plotting and data exploration with just a little bit of code. So, and this one does the same thing. It'll do plots, and I was going to just run the script here. Anyway, you can see the R executing, and then it's doing some. This is a sample that came with it, but you can see it's doing some plotting, fitted values, leverage theoretical quantiles and fitted values in this example. Anyway, it's a great place to start. Microsoft has made a big investment into R and machine learning, and it's embedded in their BI stack now. So, okay, so those are some of the tools. We're going to look again at SQL and how we can embed our R code into our SQL code and utilize the power of the R service in Microsoft SQL for data visualization. So the way that we would normally approach a project in something like this is, you have a question, right? Is there any correlation between X and Y? Do we have meaningful clusters of data? Do we have data that's related in some interesting way? And really this is the hard part, is crafting your question, and then secondly, preparing your data. Because once your data is prepared and cleaned up and aggregated in the way you want, then it's a pretty straightforward process to bring that into an R visual. But that's kind of the difficult part, and kind of it requires some SQL skills and some data aggregations, summing and grouping of the data, and to getting a data set that works. And we'll look at that a little bit. You can use really any data source. You can use a TSQL. You can use MDX out of the OLAP cubes. And the data warehouse makes it much easier, right? Because your data is all nicely conformed in facts and dimensions, and it's easy to get to and easy to work with. So data preparation is the first step. And let's take a look at that now, and then we'll go into some visualizations.
Hey, Shawn, for correlations, just to give people some ideas of what that might be like, would that be like, say you wanted to know, is there a connection between attendance rates and some demographic thing like housing status or legal status or referral source or those kinds of things? Are those examples of that?
Exactly.
All right, go ahead.
I'm going to jump over here into Management Studio here and show a little bit about how we would craft a query in SQL Server that then goes out to the machine learning server and executes that against a data set. So there's a stored procedure that functions within SQL, and it has a few variables. You define your query. Here I've got my query defined, and this is let me just execute that. This is just a really simple query. So what I did is I went through some data, and it took a few minutes to sort of get it all set up right and sum it and bring it into the query. But you can see it's a pretty simple query. It's got some cost center with a code, with some client keys and a revenue amount. This is all actually just made up data, right? It's just a made up data set. But you can see we build that query, and then we introduce that into the R engine, and this is where we start looking at our R code, right? And so we're going to use this library, this dplyr, and it's going to have the ability to take that data set and break it out into these quantiles, right? Because we want to see minimums, maximums, 25th percentile, 75th percentile, median, mean, and it just says, it calls that library, and then it just says, hey, take that data that SQL put out and then run it through the R engine, okay? So we have our R code here, and then we execute it, and we tell it that the language is going to be R in our SQL stored procedure, and then we're going to output the data, the results here. So you can see here, let's go ahead and execute the whole thing. This will take a minute. And so really a lot of this code, it didn't take very much code. I just had to map my data set to a couple of values in the R code. And see that quickly now, it shows me my number of services, my, my average revenue, my quantiles. If there's only one, like in that one, you won't see any variance. But if we look at one here, we can see that all of our quantiles are broken out. So we can look at our max and our min, our 25th percentile and our 75th percentile. So that's kind of a nice thing to do, because that lets us use the power of the SQL engine to execute our queries. So that's something else that's very useful. So this is another environment where you can utilize for R. Now, what if we don't want to use SQL? We want to just go directly to a visualization. Well, we can take our query that we did, and we can just plug it right into Power BI. So let's go into Power BI here. And here I've got a few items built. I won't go into too much detail. I won't build one from scratch just because that can take a little bit of time, but I want to show you exactly what we've done here. So I've gone into Power BI, and I've just done a get data, and I've just imported 2 queries here. So I'll go and I'll edit these queries, and you'll see the data that I brought in. In my data model. So these are just simple provider duration, cost center code, FK client, service count, right? Not a complicated data model, but it is aggregated a little bit. And I just came in, I did the get data and pasted my query into the Power BI engine, and just created a data model. I've got 2 of these in here. One is revenue, and the other is, maybe they're the same. Oh, one's service count, one's revenue. Okay. So I've got my aggregated revenue by client and by cost center. So that was my data prep step to just build those. And those are pretty straightforward queries. So I built those queries, and I brought them in. And then what I do is I selected the R script visual. So I just dragged that over and laid it on the canvas. I'll even show you that in a new one here. Let me pull up a new visualization. You just drop that. So if you drop the R script visual on the screen, then you get this R editor, right? It says drag fields into the values area in the visualization pane. So if I just bring in all of my fields from my SQL query, then it kind of automatically builds some of the initial R code for that visualization. Then I just have to add some additional code. So if I go back to my first one here, and I click on it, see there comes my R script editor. So you see here, I built myself a little bit of R code, and it's just a few lines to get this this cluster scattered plot here of my provider duration against my service count. And there's just a few things here that I have to indicate. So I want 3 clusters. I want to find 3 distinct clusters and to find similar data. Then I call my ggplot library, and there's some parameters here I set, and then I just tell it the colors I want for that. I could probably take this and copy it to my new one that I just created over here.
Living dangerously, Shawn.
That's right. Will it work? So I'll pick that one. Let's see, where's my, okay. Okay, and I'll paste it here. And then that should work. See, it's just going to build it. And that's all I have to do is paste that code. It knows how to build the visual and everything within the R code.
Nice. It's just like spinning because it's thinking. That's cool.
Yeah, so it knows it's going to do a cluster analysis, and there it is.
Nice.
Now it'll, if I refresh this again, I think it'll fill the screen a little bit better. Yeah, maybe I need to make it a little bit bigger. You can see that it knows how to bring that data in and build that chart. Oh, there we go. So it kind of stretched out a little bit. So we can see a little bit. There's a correlation. See, that data's not all over the place, right? We have a few outliers, but we can see here that as provider duration goes up, service count is somewhat linear. We do have a little bit of a change. You had an interesting observation, Ginger. What was your observation earlier when we were looking at this data?
Oh, I think it was that when we compared different cost centers, you could sort of tell that in some cost centers that duration and client and the count of services were not as like exponentially. Probably the more clients a person was seeing, it was increasing the duration of time the providers were spending with clients at a faster rate than in other cost centers. So it was interesting because you could think about it in terms of like workload, that in some programs, expanding the number of services you offer might mean like X number of hours of provider time goes up, and in other programs it might be a much bigger number of provider time goes up. So I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and here I've taken this chart and I put some filters on it, right? So that I can kind of see how the data compares if I change the value. So I have a provider duration slider here, and I can change that to kind of eliminate some outliers, and I can also remove some of my cost centers, right? So I'm going to go ahead and change a cost center and remove a cost center. You'll see this chart change. See, it kind of changes. And it lets us kind of zero in on different cost centers and compare two cost centers. So say, I'm getting a lot of values that are out here further on the axis for my Colgate cost center. So as my I'm seeing a little bit different distribution here from the services and the service count in that cost center than I do in these others that I have selected, which can tell you some things about your data like Ginger just mentioned. But I could pick just a single one if I wanted to by putting these filters in there. And we'll see this change. That's interesting. Okay, so that one's got that one doesn't show as quite as good of a clustering. Let's look at the Colgate one. Come back. Oh, that's showing a little bit better correlation. We'll look at the GRASP cost center. Okay, oh, that's much stronger correlation in that data. Interesting. And this is all happening real time in that R engine in the background. Oh, that one's much more. Well, we're seeing some correlation here in the middle with some outliers off to the side. So that's a really interesting thing to look at. This here is a provider duration by cost center. It's supposed to be a box plot, but it's the value, the outlier values are so high that you don't see much. But if we go to this next one, this next one is dealing with revenue instead of service count. And so you can see here that revenue by cost center, the box plot works out a little bit better. You can look at our cost center and then look at our box plot. So we have the lower edge is our 25th percentile, the top is the 75th. This is our median, and then we have some outliers up above, and then we have our maximum here. And you can kind of see the range and the variance of the data. Also with some interesting, we can also filter that out. Again, these are just, if we click on one of these, we can see, I mean, this box plot was literally just a little bit of code. I just called my two libraries. I said, pull in that data set, give it a couple of variables, tell it a box plot, give it some colors. I mean, it was really just 4 lines of code in that one. We can take the data and plug it into a chart. One nice thing about Power BI is you can bring in these custom visuals in Power BI. So I brought in a chord chart, which is, it looks like a pie chart, which I don't normally use. But the chord chart is kind of nice because it's kind of a pie chart that kind of is trying to overcome the weaknesses of a pie chart. You can see that the green is like the total, and then it breaks out the individual amounts, the individual cost center amounts.
It's almost like a hybrid between a bar, like between a column or bar chart and a pie chart, isn't it? Huh?
Yeah.
A little hybrid.
So this is a service count by cost center and then a revenue by cost center. You can kind of see, you can see how those break out a little bit, and that's interesting. The revenue by cost center, the XYZ services is bigger, but in service count, mental wellness is pretty, they're pretty close there. And I guess XYZ is still bigger. Now, another interesting thing that you can do as you're looking at this data is you can bring in some association rule and cluster frequency. So this is just another little bit of code. So if you want to see how your data breaks out, you can look at your different clusters and the frequency that the items appear. That items appear in the different clusters. Kind of an interesting thing that R does. So you can kind of look at your data and make some assumptions about it. You can combine filtering and slicers with this data, and it changes the data in real time. So you can be creative with the questions you're asking. Here we can see that the mental wellness, it's got a little shallower trend line, or intercept there, as compared to what looks like what our insight group. So it's some interesting things to see there. All right, well, good. So the other tool we wanted to look at was utilizing the R in SQL reporting services. So I have a SQL reporting report here that I've built on some of this same code, right? Except on this one, instead of using a native R ggplot visualization, I'm using the native visualization, box plot visualization, but I'm utilizing the R services in SQL. So let me show you that query. This is one that we've looked at before. So I'm just looking at my revenue data set, but I'm summing the data up a little bit. I'm summing up the revenue and then looking at the number of services per client by cost center and the amount of revenue, and then looking at the distribution. So the query is pretty simple, and then this is just kind of boilerplate R code, and then I just say, hey, put it all together and give me the output. And I just paste this whole thing within the query designer in R services. And there it is. There's my whole query there, and it's going to give me the appropriate output. So it goes in, it's executing the query against SQL, but it's using the machine learning services in the SQL server to execute the R code. And then we can just run that report, And we'll see that output as a box plot for our services. So we can kind of see some of the same things here. We can see that we've got quite a bit of outliers. There's quite a bit of variance. We have some services that are way high. You know, there's not very many of them, but you can see because our 25th to 75th percentile is clear down here. And we've got a service way up there. We can change that vertical axis property to logarithmic. It's a little easier to read. We don't get the detail. There you go. That's just going out. That's utilizing the R, but with the native SSRS visualization in there.
Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you'd like more information, please contact Pinnacle Health Informatics at 971-409-6931 or at the email listed.